The wrong car. Derek Stone checked his watch for the fifth time in less than 2 minutes. His expensive wristwatch, a limited edition Swiss design worth more than most people's yearly salary, gleamed under the late afternoon sun. But for Derek, it wasn't about the shine or the craft. It was about control. Control over his time, control over his life, control over the people around him. And today, control was slipping away. His luxury Mercedes had broken down earlier that morning. It was humiliating. Derek never dealt with breakdowns. He paid people to deal with things like that. His assistant usually handled the logistics, but she had called in sick, and Derek had been forced to use something he had never touched before. Uber. He hated the thought of it. Sitting in a stranger's car, depending on someone else's timing, it was beneath him. But with an important meeting across town and no other choice, he had tapped the app with irritation and ordered a ride. Now, standing at the curb with his leather briefcase in hand, he waited for the car to arrive. A silver Toyota Corolla slowed near the traffic light. Derek glanced at his phone. The app showed a silver sedan, license plate numbers he didn't bother memorizing. Good enough, he thought. Without hesitation, he strode over, opened the back door, and tossed his briefcase onto the seat like a general dropping his sword before battle. He slid in, pulling the door shut. "Go. Just go," he commanded, not even looking at the driver. The woman behind the wheel stiffened. "What?" she whispered, her voice a little husky, trembling with confusion. "Come on, lady, just drive," Derek muttered, already typing on his phone, his eyes glued to the glowing screen. The woman's eyes widened. Her heart began to race. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She thought she was being robbed. "Oh my God, I want to live," she gasped, slamming her foot on the accelerator. The Toyota lurched forward into traffic, swerving slightly before steadying. Derek finally looked up, frowning. "What are you doing?" Her voice shook as she cried out, "Please don't hurt me. Take whatever you want, just don't kill me." Derek blinked, utterly baffled. "What?" She was in full panic, tears stinging her eyes. To her, this tall, well-dressed man in the back seat, throwing in a heavy black briefcase and barking orders like a criminal, seemed every bit the dangerous robber she'd heard about in late-night news stories. "Lady, calm down. I'm not here to rob you," Derek said, raising his voice. Her hands trembled on the wheel. "Then why did you just jump into my car? Who are you?" "I'm your passenger," Derek snapped. "This is Uber, isn't it?" That made her slam on the brakes so suddenly that Derek nearly smacked his head on the seat in front of him. Horns blared behind them as cars screeched to avoid hitting the Toyota. She twisted around, her brown eyes blazing with shock and anger. "This is not Uber," she shouted. "I don't drive Uber. This is my car." For the first time in a very long while, Derek Stone was speechless. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The woman behind the wheel, her name was Maya Carter. 26 years old, dressed in a faded green blouse and worn-out jeans, her hair tied back in a messy bun. She had just finished a long shift at the diner where she worked, and she was on her way to pick up her little brother from school. The last thing she expected was a stranger in a suit barging into her car and ordering her to drive like she was some kind of chauffeur. But the fear was real. The city wasn't safe. She had heard enough stories about women being carjacked at stoplights, dragged out of their vehicles, or worse. Her heart had leapt into her throat when this man entered without permission. Now, as she stared at him, confusion mingled with her fear. He didn't look like a robber. He looked important. His suit was perfectly tailored, his hair neatly styled, his shoes polished. Everything about him screamed money, but that only made her more furious. "Get out!" she shouted, pointing at the door. Derek adjusted his tie, trying to regain control of the situation. "Look, I thought this was my ride. Honest mistake. No need to cause a scene." "No need?" Maya's voice broke, her chest rising and falling fast. "You scared me half to death." For once, Derek's usual arrogance faltered. He had expected an apology, maybe some nervous laughter, then the matter closed. But this woman wasn't laughing. She wasn't impressed. She was furious. The clash. Traffic honked around them, drivers leaning out of windows to curse at the stopped Toyota. Derek sighed in annoyance. Fine, I'll get out. But as he reached for his briefcase, something inside him hesitated. Her fire, her raw emotion. It was unlike anything he usually faced. People around Derek were always polished, controlled, careful with their words around the billionaire CEO. But this woman? She wasn't afraid to unleash her anger. What's your name? He asked suddenly. Maya narrowed her eyes. None of your business. Just get out. Fair enough, Derek muttered, sliding the briefcase toward him. He opened the door and stepped out onto the curb, but before closing the door, he looked at her again. For the record, you've got guts. Not many people would yell at me like that. Good, she shot back, her hand still gripping the wheel. Maybe you'll think twice before scaring another woman. The door shut with a solid thump. Maya pulled away quickly, her heart still pounding, muttering under her breath. Rich people think they can do anything. Derek stood on the sidewalk holding his briefcase, watching her car disappear into traffic. For a brief moment, something stirred inside him, something he couldn't quite place. And for the first time in years, Derek Stone was unsettled. The hook for what's coming, what Derek didn't know was that this mistake wasn't the end of their encounter. It was only the beginning. That wrong car, that moment of fear and fire, would set into motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he believed about power, success, and human worth. And Maya, the woman who had screamed at him like no one dared, was about to become the person who changed his life forever. The clash of worlds. Derek Stone rarely thought about ordinary people. His life revolved around boardrooms, private jets, luxury hotels, and conversations with men and women who wore tailored suits and spoke the language of numbers and power. His calendar was filled months in advance with meetings that decided the fate of millions of dollars. Yet for all the weight of his schedule, everything always seemed carefully controlled, polished, and rehearsed. Nothing about his world was accidental until the wrong car. That brief and chaotic encounter with Maya Carter had shaken him in a way he couldn't explain. He had expected his mistake to be nothing more than a passing inconvenience, something to laugh about later over a glass of imported wine. But instead, her anger and fearless outbursts kept replaying in his head. The way her voice had trembled with fear yet turned sharp with courage. The fire in her eyes when she told him off. No one had spoken to him like that in years. Everyone in his world either feared him or flattered him, but she had treated him like a nuisance, like a man who had crossed a boundary. It stung his pride, but strangely it also intrigued him. Later that evening, Derek sat in his penthouse apartment overlooking the city skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows gave him a view most people would consider priceless, but tonight, he barely noticed the lights glittering like stars below. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, loosened his tie, and sat in silence. His mind, usually racing with numbers and strategies, was strangely quiet, except for the image of a young woman in a battered car, gripping her steering wheel as if her life depended on it. He should have forgotten her already, just another face in the endless sea of the city. But something about her refusal to be intimidated pulled at him. For the first time in years, Derek felt as though he had met someone who didn't care about his wealth or his name. She had looked at him not as a billionaire CEO, but simply as a man who had barged into her space and scared her. That unfiltered honesty gnawed at him. Maya, on the other hand, had her own thoughts that evening, though they were far less indulgent. By the time she pulled into the small driveway of the modest two-bedroom house she shared with her mother and younger brother, her nerves were still buzzing. She cut the ignition and leaned back against the seat, breathing heavily as the events replayed in her mind. At first, the fear had been overwhelming. She had truly believed she was being attacked. But then, when the shock faded, she was left with anger. Who did that man think he was? Jumping into her car, barking orders like she was his employee? She had dealt with arrogant customers at the diner before, but never something so bold, so entitled. She knew he had money. Everything about him screamed it, but money didn't give someone the right to treat others like they were invisible. Her younger brother, Jordan, ran out of the house to greet her, his backpack bouncing against his small frame. He was only 11 whites, D-eyed and endlessly curious about the world. "You're late," he said with a grin, climbing into the passenger seat as she ruffled his hair. Traffic, she answered, forcing a smile, though her mind was still elsewhere. Inside the house, their mother, who worked nights as a nurse, was already preparing to leave for her shift. The weight of responsibility settled on Maya's shoulders once again. She was only 26, but she felt much older. Between long hours at the diner, caring for Jordan, and helping her mother with bills, she rarely had time for herself. That strange encounter with the man in the suit had been terrifying, but it also reminded her of the gap between people like him and people like her. For some, life was about choosing which luxury car to drive. For others, like her, it was about choosing which bill to pay first. The next morning, Derek found himself distracted during his meetings. He sat at the head of the conference table, his team presenting projections and strategies, but his mind wandered. He remembered the look in Maya's eyes, the fear that had turned to defiance. He tried to shake it off, annoyed with himself. Why should he care about a random woman he had accidentally scared? He told himself it was ridiculous, but the thought persisted. Something about her had unsettled the careful walls he had built around his life. He realized, perhaps with some discomfort, that he admired her courage. Most people bowed in his presence, yet she had thrown his arrogance back at him without hesitation. Fate, however, wasn't done with them. A week later, Derek's path crossed with Maya's again, though neither of them expected it. Derek had arranged a lunch meeting at a popular downtown restaurant, a place known for its high-end cuisine and elegant atmosphere. As he entered the restaurant with two of his executives, he barely noticed the waitstaff bustling around, until a familiar voice stopped him in his tracks. "Good afternoon, table for 3. He looked up, and there she was, Maya, standing in front of him with a notepad in hand, wearing the simple uniform of the restaurant's servers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Her eyes widened as recognition struck, and her lips tightened into a thin line. Derek felt a strange jolt in his chest, something between embarrassment and intrigue. Of all the places in the city, of all the people he could have encountered again, it had to be her. Maya straightened her shoulders, her professional mask sliding into place, though he could see the flicker of annoyance in her expression. "Follow me," she said coolly, leading him and his guest to their table. Derek, for once, was at a loss for words. He wanted to say something, to apologize maybe, but the presence of his executives kept him silent. Maya set down their menus, her voice even but clipped. "Your server will be with you shortly." Then she turned on her heel and walked away without another glance. Throughout the lunch, Derek found it hard to focus. His colleagues discussed contracts and partnerships, but his eyes drifted toward the section where Maya worked. She moved quickly, balancing trays, taking orders, and smiling politely at customers. There was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself, a determination that struck him. She was not the type to crumble under pressure. He found himself thinking about how easily she could have been swallowed by fear that night in the car, but instead, she had chosen defiance. That same defiance seemed to guide her now as she worked tirelessly, unnoticed by most of the wealthy diners around her. When the meal ended and his colleagues left, Derek lingered behind. He waited until Maya returned to clear the table, then finally spoke. "You work here?" he asked, his tone softer than usual. She gave him a sharp look. "Obviously. What, does that surprise you?" "Not exactly," he said carefully. "I just didn't expect to see you again." "Well, the world doesn't revolve around your expectations," she replied, stacking the plates with quick movements. Her words, though curt, struck him with unusual force. Derek was used to being treated with deference, but Maya's blunt honesty disarmed him. He opened his mouth to reply, but she cut him off. "If you're waiting for an apology, you're not getting one. You scared me half to death that day. You don't just jump into a woman's car like that." "I wasn't asking for an apology," Derek said quietly, his usual arrogance replaced by something unfamiliar, humility. I wanted to say I'm sorry. It was my mistake." Maya froze for a moment, surprised. She hadn't expected him to apologize. Something in his tone seemed genuine, but she quickly buried her reaction beneath a layer of sarcasm. "Well, congratulations. You admitted you're human after all." Derek chuckled softly, a sound even he hadn't expected. "Fair enough." Maya shook her head, muttering under her breath as she walked away, but Derek sat there watching her, realizing something he couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, someone had forced him to confront himself. Not with fear, not with flattery, but with truth. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of a clash that would change them both in ways neither could imagine. The struggle beneath the surface. The following week unfolded like most others for Maya Carter, yet beneath the surface, something had shifted. Her encounter with Derek at the restaurant lingered in her mind, not because she wanted it to, but because it had unsettled her. She had dealt with arrogant men before, customers who snapped their fingers at her, managers who dismissed her ideas, even strangers on the street who thought her worth could be measured by the tired uniform she wore. But Derek was different. Not better, not kinder, just different. He had entered her life like a storm, sudden, chaotic, and unforgettable. She hated how her thoughts drifted back to him, even when she was trying to focus on more pressing matters, like paying the overdue electricity bill or making sure her brother Jordan's school shoes didn't have holes in them before the cold weather came. Life at home was a constant balancing act. Their house, small and worn, carried the weight of years of sacrifice. The walls were thin, the pipes groaned, and the roof leaked whenever it rained too hard. Maya's mother, exhausted from her night shifts at the hospital, often collapsed into bed just as Maya was heading out for her own long hours at the diner. Between them, they kept the household afloat, but barely. Sometimes Maya wondered how long they could keep going like this, living paycheck to paycheck, always one unexpected expense away from disaster. She rarely allowed herself to dream, because dreams felt like luxuries she couldn't afford. Yet despite the heaviness of her days, Maya carried herself with a quiet dignity. She didn't complain, she didn't crumble, and she refused to let hardship define her spirit. Meanwhile, Derek Stone lived in a different universe altogether. His penthouse was filled with art that collectors fought over, wines that aged in cellars across the world, and technology so advanced it practically thought for him. Yet in that silence, surrounded by the trappings of wealth, Derek felt something he could not ignore: emptiness. The sharp words Maya had thrown at him replayed in his head. The world doesn't revolve around your expectations. At first, he had brushed them off as defiance, but the more he thought about them, the more he realized how true they were. He had built an empire around control, controlling markets, controlling people, even controlling time itself through his relentless schedules. But in that diner waitress's simple statement, he heard something no one else dared tell him. His money could not control the truth of how others saw him. One evening, as Derek returned from another long day of meetings, he found himself driving through a part of town he rarely visited. His chauffeur took a wrong turn, and suddenly the polished streets and shining towers gave way to cracked sidewalks, flickering streetlights, and tired buildings that bore the marks of years of neglect. Derek glanced out the window, watching children playing with makeshift toys, their laughter echoing against the backdrop of peeling paint and sagging porches. Something about it struck him. It was raw, unfiltered life. He realized with discomfort that he had not seen this world in years, not since his own childhood, before his family's fortunes had shifted. And then, in the glow of a corner store's neon light, he saw her. Maya stood outside, holding a grocery bag in one arm and gently guiding her younger brother with the other. She was laughing at something he had said, though the exhaustion in her posture betrayed the weight she carried. Derek leaned forward slightly in his seat, his chest tightening with something he didn't quite understand. Here was the same woman who had yelled at him, who had looked him in the eye without fear, now showing a tenderness and strength that made her seem even more remarkable. She was not playing a role, not performing for anyone's approval. She was simply living and doing it with a grace that humbled him. Derek said nothing to his driver, but that image stayed with him long after they had driven away. It gnawed at him through his evening routine, through his glass of whiskey, through the endless reports he skimmed on his tablet. Why did she matter? Why did he, a man who could have anything he wanted, find himself thinking about a waitress from a modest neighborhood? He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. But deep down, he knew it was something else, a recognition of strength in her that he had lost somewhere along his climb to the top. For Maya, the struggles only grew heavier. The following week, her mother fell ill, the long night shifts finally catching up to her. Bills piled higher, hours at the diner stretched longer, and Jordan needed help with school projects that demanded time she didn't have. Maya pushed herself harder, but her body began to feel the strain. She told herself to keep going, that quitting wasn't an option, but some nights, when the house was quiet and her brother was asleep, she allowed herself to cry silently into her pillow. It was on one of those particularly difficult days that Derek walked into the diner again. He hadn't planned to, at least, that's what he told himself. But when his morning meeting ended early, he found his car pulling into the familiar parking lot. As he entered, the bell above the door chimed, and he scanned the room until he found her. She was there, balancing a tray with practiced skill, moving from table to table with a polite smile that barely concealed her fatigue. Derek took a seat at an empty booth, his presence drawing curious glances from other customers. A billionaire in a humble diner was unusual, but Derek hardly noticed. His eyes were fixed on Maya. When she finally approached his table, her expression was unreadable. "Back again?" she asked flatly, pulling out her notepad. Derek smiled faintly, though it was more awkward than charming. "What can I say? I like the atmosphere." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Or maybe you just like bothering me." "Maybe a little of both," he admitted, surprising even himself with his honesty. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Was it amusement or annoyance? She quickly masked it. "What do you want to order?" As she scribbled down his choice, Derek found himself studying her more closely. He noticed the faint circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly when she held the pen. She wound, as exhausted, yet she carried herself with pride. Most people in her position would complain, but Maya did not. She worked, she endured, she fought quietly for her family's survival. Derek realized, with an unsettling clarity, that he respected her. The meal came and went, but what lingered was their conversation. Derek tried to draw her out, asking about her life, her family, her dreams, but Maya guarded her answers carefully. She did not trust easily, especially not a man like him. Still, something about the way he listened, genuinely without interrupting, made her pause. For once, someone was looking at her not as a server, not as a shadow, but as a person worth hearing. By the time Derek left the diner, he knew one thing for certain. He could no longer ignore the pull he felt toward her. Maya Carter was not just a chance encounter. She was becoming the mirror he didn't know he needed. The reminder that wealth meant nothing without humanity, and that sometimes the greatest strength lay not in commanding others, but in surviving with dignity when the world gave you nothing. And for Maya, though she refused to admit it even to herself, Derek's presence had stirred something as well. She didn't like him, not yet. She didn't trust him, but she couldn't deny the strange truth. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. The breakthrough. The city was alive with its usual rhythm, cars weaving through traffic, neon signs flickering to life as the sun dipped behind the skyline, and crowds spilling out of offices, eager to escape another long day. For Maya Carter, however, the evening felt heavier than usual. She was leaving the diner after a 12-hour shift, her legs aching and her mind fogged from exhaustion. Her manager had asked her to stay longer because another server had called in sick. And though her body screamed for rest, she had agreed. She always agreed. And there was no room in her life to say no, not when bills piled higher each week and her mother's health was growing more fragile by the day. She tightened her jacket against the crisp wind, balancing a grocery bag in one hand and her purse in the other. The streets in her neighborhood were dimly lit, and she quickened her pace, wanting to reach home before it grew too dark. Jordan would be waiting, probably hungry and eager to show her his latest drawings. Just the thought of his bright smile gave her the strength to keep moving. Meanwhile, across town, Derek Stone was attending a charity gala hosted at a luxury hotel. The grand ballroom glowed with chandeliers, and the air was thick with the scent of perfume and the sound of laughter polished to perfection. Men in tuxedos and women in glittering gowns mingled, champagne flutes in hand, while a string quartet played softly in the corner. Derek was used to these events. They were as much a part of his calendar as board meetings and quarterly reviews. Yet tonight, he felt strangely disconnected. He shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, and smiled at the right moments. But inside, he felt hollow. The words people spoke here felt rehearsed, their laughter manufactured. He found himself scanning the room for something real, something unpolished, something that reminded him of the fire he had seen in Maya's eyes. Later that night, as fate would have it, Derek's driver took a shortcut through a part of town Derek usually never visited, the very same streets where Maya was walking home. As the car slowed at a red light, Derek glanced out the tinted window and froze. There she was, Maya clutching her grocery bag, her shoulders hunched against the cold, her steps quick and purposeful. She looked tired, more tired than she had at the diner, yet she carried herself with that same quiet strength. Derek felt an unexpected tug in his chest. He hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "Pull over," he told his driver. The chauffeur glanced at him in the rearview mirrors. Or uncertain. "Sir, this isn't—" "I said pull over." The car eased to the curb, and Derek stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He approached Maya slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Maya," he called softly. She spun around, her eyes widening when she recognized him. "You?" Her voice was a mix of disbelief and irritation. "Are you following me now?" Derek raised his hand slightly, a gesture of peace. "No, I saw you walking. I thought you might need a ride." Maya's grip on her grocery bag tightened. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity," Derek replied, his tone calm but earnest. "It's just a ride, that's all." For a moment she said nothing, studying him under the flickering streetlight. He looked out of place here in his tailored suit, his presence like a sharp contrast against the worn sidewalks and cracked buildings. Part of her wanted to turn away, to reject him outright, but another part, tired, weighed down and cold, hesitated. Finally, she exhaled sharply. "Fine, but just this once." Inside the car, the silence between them was heavy. Derek wanted to speak, to bridge the distance, but he could sense the tension in her posture. She sat rigidly, her eyes fixed on the darkened streets outside. It was Maya who finally broke the silence. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice low. Derek glanced at her. "Because I want to help." She let out a bitter laugh. "People like you don't help people like me. You don't even see us. To you, we're invisible until we're serving you drinks or cleaning up your mess." Her words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Derek leaned back in his seat, her honesty striking deeper than any boardroom critique ever had. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "I haven't seen people. Not really. But I see you." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. She turned to look at him, searching his face for mockery, but found none. For the first time, she glimpsed not the billionaire CEO, but a man stripped of his usual arrogance, a man willing to admit his flaws. Before she could respond, the car jolted to a stop. A commotion erupted near the corner ahead, a group of teenagers, rowdy and aggressive, blocking the sidewalk where Maya usually walked. One of them kicked over a trash can, sending bottles clattering across the pavement. Another shouted something crude at a passerby. Maya stiffened, recognizing them from the neighborhood. They were troublemakers, known for picking fights and harassing anyone who crossed their path. Derek noticed her reaction. "Do you know them?" She nodded, her voice tight. "They've caused problems before. I usually just avoid them." Without thinking, Derek spoke firmly to his driver. "Stay here." Then he turned to Maya. "You're not walking past them tonight. I'll take you to your door." Maya blinked at him in surprise. "Why would you?" "Because you shouldn't have to face that alone," he said simply. And so, for the first time, Derek Stone walked beside Maya Carter through the cracked sidewalks of her world. The teenagers jeered as they passed, but one sharp look from Derek, cold, commanding, the kind that had silenced entire boardrooms, was enough to make them mutter and step back. Maya watched with a mix of shock and grudging admiration. For all his arrogance, there was a strength in him that felt strangely protective. When they finally reached her small house, Maya turned to him, her voice softer than before. "Thank you for walking me home." Derek met her gaze, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged with something unspoken. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "But maybe next time, you'll believe me when I say I'm not your enemy." Maya studied him, torn between suspicion and a reluctant shift in her heart. She didn't trust him, not yet, but tonight he had shown her something she hadn't expected: humanity. As Derek returned to his car, he realized something profound. For years he had measured success in profits and power, but tonight his sense of purpose had come from something far simpler: standing beside a woman who had no reason to trust him and earning, if only for a moment, a flicker of her respect. And though neither of them knew it, that simple act, the walk home under the flickering streetlights, was the beginning of a transformation that would reshape both of their lives. The transformation. The following days seemed to pass in a strange rhythm for Derek Stone. Meetings, calls, contracts, and deadlines still filled his calendar, but he found himself unable to focus with the same sharpness he once prided himself on. He caught himself staring out of boardroom windows, his mind wandering not to profit margins or market shares, but to the flicker of determination he had seen in Maya's eyes when she insisted she didn't need his help, and to the quiet gratitude that had softened her tone when he walked her home that night. For years, Derek had surrounded himself with polished people who flattered him, who agreed with him, who told him what he wanted to hear. But in the space of a few weeks, a young woman from a world so different from his own had pierced the armor of his arrogance and forced him to see himself through her unfiltered lens. It was unsettling, but it was also strangely liberating. Maya, on the other hand, was fighting her own battle. She could not ignore the unease that lingered after Derek had walked her home. It wasn't just gratitude she felt. It was something more complicated, something she didn't want to admit. She had always distrusted men like him. Powerful, entitled, accustomed to bending the world to their will. Yet in that one act of solidarity, Derek had shown her a side she hadn't expected, a willingness to step into her world, however briefly, without judgment. Still, she reminded herself that she couldn't afford to be naive. She had responsibilities: her family, her job, her survival. She couldn't risk her heart on someone like him. But fate had a way of weaving their paths together. One afternoon, Derek arrived at the diner unannounced. Maya nearly dropped the tray she was carrying when she saw him walk through the door in his tailored suit, drawing the attention of every customer in the room. He chose the same booth as before, sliding into the seat with a confidence that seemed out of place in the humble diner. When she approached him, her expression was cool, though her pulse quickened in spite of herself. "You again," she said, setting down a glass of water. "Don't you have 100 fancier places to eat?" Derek smiled faintly. "Probably, but none with the same company." Her lips tightened, and she shook her head, scribbling down his order. "Flattery won't get you anywhere." "I'm not flattering you," he said calmly. "I'm telling the truth." Maya turned away quickly, refusing to let his words sink in. Yet as she moved through her shift, she found herself stealing glances at him, wondering why a man who could dine in the most exclusive restaurants in the city would keep coming back here. She wanted to dismiss it as curiosity or arrogance, but deep down she knew it was more than that. When her shift ended and she stepped outside into the cool evening air, Derek was waiting by his car. She groaned inwardly, walking past him with determined strides, but his voice stopped her. "Let me walk you again." She turned sharply. "You don't have to play the hero. I can take care of myself." "I know you can," he said, his gaze steady. "But sometimes even the strongest people deserve to have someone walk beside them." Something in his tone, gentle, sincere, stripped of arrogance, made her falter. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire CEO, but simply a man trying, awkwardly and earnestly, to bridge the distance between their worlds. Against her better judgment, she allowed him to fall into step beside her. As they walked, the conversation flowed more easily than either expected. Maya told him about her brother Jordan, about her mother's long night shifts, about the exhaustion that came from working 2 jobs. Derek listened quietly, truly listening, something few people ever did for her. In turn, Derek shared pieces of his own story, not the polished version he told investors, but fragments of his childhood, the struggles his family had faced before fortune smiled on them. He spoke of loneliness, of the constant pressure to maintain power, of how success had isolated him more than it had connected him. For the first time in years, Derek dropped the mask of the invincible CEO and revealed the vulnerable man underneath. By the time they reached her house, Maya felt a conflict raging inside her. She didn't want to trust him, yet she couldn't deny the sincerity she had seen in his eyes. He was changing, or at least trying to, and that unsettled her even more than his arrogance had. As she reached for her door, Derek hesitated before speaking. "Maya," he said softly, "I know I don't deserve your trust yet, but I want to. Not because of what I have, but because of who I'm trying to become." Her hand froze on the doorknob. She didn't reply, but the silence between them carried weight. Finally, she whispered, "Actions speak louder than words, Derek. If you're serious, prove it." Those words echoed in his mind long after he returned to his penthouse. They were a challenge, and Derek Stone was not a man who backed down from challenges. But this was different. This wasn't about conquering markets or expanding empires. This was about confronting himself, the arrogance, the selfishness, the walls he had built. And for the first time, he wanted to tear those walls down, not for power, not for recognition, but for the chance to earn the respect of a woman who saw him as nothing more than human. The transformation would not be easy. It would require humility, patience, and vulnerability, all things Derek had long considered weaknesses. Yet as he stood by his window that night, looking out at the glittering city below, he realized that true strength was not in controlling others, but in learning to walk beside them. And in that realization, a new path began to unfold, one that would lead him away from the hollow victories of wealth and towards something far more profound: redemption. The turning point. The weeks that followed seemed to draw Derek and Maya into an orbit neither of them could escape. Their encounters, once accidental, had now become deliberate. Derek continued to visit the diner, not because of the food. It was simple, ordinary fare compared to what he was used to, but because of the quiet strength he found in Maya's presence. She never treated him like the others did, never bowed to his wealth, never softened her words to please him. She challenged him, confronted him, even dismissed him when he slipped into old habits of arrogance. At first, that had unsettled him. Now he found it strangely refreshing, like a gust of honest air cutting through the stale atmosphere of his carefully curated world. Maya, though still cautious, began to notice the changes in him. He listened more. He didn't bark orders the way he once had. He asked questions, not to pry, but to understand. He had even stopped arriving in his chauffeured car when he visited the diner, choosing instead to walk the few blocks from his office. It was almost disarming to see him sitting quietly at a booth, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up, waiting patiently like any other customer. And though she would never admit it openly, part of her had grown to expect him, even to look forward to their conversations at the end of her shift. But Derek's transformation was about to be tested in a way neither of them had imagined. One Friday evening, the diner was unusually crowded. Families filled the booths, laughter mingled with the clatter of dishes, and the staff scrambled to keep up. Maya was carrying a tray of drinks when a group of wealthy businessmen entered, their voices loud and commanding, their suits sharp and expensive. They took a table near the center, and from the moment they sat down, their presence dominated the room. Maya recognized them almost immediately. They were investors, men with ties to Derek's world. She had seen their names in articles when Derek's company had been featured in the news. The moment they noticed her, their eyes narrowed. One of them, a balding man with a smug grin, leaned back in his chair and said loudly enough for several tables to hear, "Well, if it isn't the little waitress, how fitting. I suppose this is where people like you belong." The other men chuckled, their laughter carrying through the room. Maya stiffened, her tray balanced carefully in her hands. She had dealt with insults before, but something about their tone, the deliberate cruelty, the way they wanted others to hear, struck deeper than usual. She bit her tongue, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction, and set the drinks down on their table with steady hands. But the man wasn't done. "You know," he continued, his grin widening, "Derek Stone has been seen around here a lot lately. Visiting you, isn't that right? A billionaire with a waitress? That's rich." His friends roared with laughter and Maya's cheeks burned with humiliation. Before she could respond, a voice cut through the room, calm yet firm, carrying the weight of authority. "That's enough." The laughter faltered, heads turned. And there he was, Derek Stone, standing at the entrance, his expression cold and sharp. He had arrived moments earlier, unnoticed, but now every eye in the diner was on him. He walked toward the table with measured steps, his presence commanding the kind of silence that only true power could summon. The businessmen shifted uncomfortably but tried to mask it with a sneer. "Derek, we were just having a little fun. No harm done." Derek stopped beside Maya, his gaze never leaving the man's face. Humiliating someone for your own amusement isn't fun. It's weakness. His voice was calm, but every syllable landed with weight. The man laughed nervously. "Come on, Derek, she's just a waitress. Don't tell me—" "She's not just anything," Derek interrupted sharply. The room seemed to hold its breath. "She's stronger than half the men in this room. She works harder in a single day than most of you have in your entire lives. And if you can't see that, then you don't deserve to sit at her table, let alone mock her." The businessman's face reddened, his mouth opening and closing without words. Derek's reputation was formidable. Few dared oppose him so directly. The other investors shifted uncomfortably, suddenly finding their menus far more interesting. Maya, stunned, stood frozen at his side. She had expected many things from Derek: arrogance, charm, even fleeting kindness, but never this. Never a public defense that cut through the hierarchy of wealth and power and placed her, a waitress in a simple uniform, at the center of respect. Derek turned slightly, his gaze softening as it fell on her. "You don't have to tolerate this," he said quietly, though loud enough for the room to hear. "Not from them. Not from anyone." For a long moment, silence hung in the air, heavy and electric. Then slowly the hum of conversation returned, subdued and cautious. The businessmen avoided Derek's eyes, their earlier bravado crushed under the weight of his words. Maya finally found her voice, though it trembled. "Why did you do that?" Derek looked at her, his expression unflinching. "Because actions speak louder than words, and you told me to prove it." Her breath caught. She had thrown those words at him weeks ago, never expecting him to take them to heart, never imagining he would remember. Yet here he was, standing before her, not as the untouchable billionaire she had once resented, but as a man who was willing to risk his image, his reputation, even his relationships in his world, just to defend her dignity. For the rest of the evening, Maya worked in a haze, her mind replaying the moment over and over. Derek stayed, quietly occupying his usual booth, but she could feel the weight of his presence, not oppressive, but protective. And though she wanted to remain guarded, to remind herself of the distance between them, she could not deny what she had seen with her own eyes, a man truly trying to change. That night, as Derek walked her home again, the silence between them was different. It was no longer filled with suspicion or guarded tension. It was filled with something unspoken but powerful: respect, trust beginning to take root, and the fragile possibility of something more. For Derek, the turning point was clear. He had spent years building walls of power and wealth around himself, but in defending Maya, he had discovered a truth he had long forgotten. Strength was not about dominating others. It was about standing up for those who couldn't, or wouldn't, stand alone. And for the first time in his life, Derek Stone felt that perhaps his greatest victory was not in the empire he had built, but in the courage he had found to change, the resolution. The night after Derek publicly stood up for Maya at the diner spread like wildfire across the city's business circles. Word traveled fast in Derek Stone's world, and by morning, the whispers had already reached the polished boardrooms and glass offices where investors and executives measured respect in power and reputation. Some were shocked, others amused, and a few even outraged that a man of Derek's stature would risk his image defending a waitress. Yet for Derek, the consequences no longer mattered. He had spent years living for the approval of men like them, playing by their rules, wearing their masks. But the moment he had stood by Maya, he had felt freer than he had in decades. For once, he hadn't spoken to impress or to intimidate. He had spoken the truth. And that truth had been worth more than all the flattery and fear his wealth had ever bought him. Maya, meanwhile, wrestled with a storm of emotions. She was grateful, more than grateful, for what Derek had done. His words had struck through her humiliation like a shield, restoring her dignity in front of men who had tried to strip it away. But gratitude was only part of it. She also felt unsettled because she had seen a man she once dismissed as arrogant and untouchable become someone different right before her eyes. He had remembered her challenge, actions speak louder than words, and he had proven himself in a way she could not ignore. And that frightened her. Not because she doubted his sincerity, but because it meant she could no longer deny that he was changing, and that change was stirring feelings in her heart she had tried so hard to guard against. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Derek and Maya's lives intertwined in ways that neither of them could have predicted. Derek began visiting Maya's neighborhood, not as a spectacle, but quietly, humbly. He funded a renovation of the SMA's, a community park where children played, though he made sure his name was never on the plaque. He arranged for scholarships at Jordan's school, though he never told Maya directly that he was behind it. And most surprisingly of all, he started spending less time at the endless galas and events that had once defined his calendar, and more time in the unassuming diner where he had first learned to see himself through Maya's unfiltered eyes. For Maya, the changes were impossible to ignore. She watched as Derek shed layer after layer of arrogance, not overnight, but in small, deliberate choices. He asked about her mother's health, about Jordan's grades, about her own dreams, questions no one had ever bothered to ask before. He didn't just listen. He remembered, followed up, cared. At first, she resisted, telling herself it was a performance, a temporary fascination that would fade once the novelty wore off. But as time passed, she realized this was not performance. This was transformation. And while she was wary of giving her heart away, she could not deny the truth. Derek Stone was becoming a man she could respect, perhaps even love. The defining moment came one evening when the diner hosted a local charity event. The owner had organized it to raise money for struggling families in the neighborhood, and Maya had thrown herself into helping plan it. She decorated the modest space with paper lanterns, strung together borrowed lights, and prepared trays of simple but warm food. The turnout was larger than expected. Families, teachers, neighbors, all gathering under the glow of shared struggle and hope. Maya worked tirelessly throughout the night, her face flushed with effort, but her spirit bright. When Derek arrived, he did not come in a tailored suit or with an entourage. He came alone, dressed simply, blending into the crowd in a way that surprised everyone. People aired his name, shocked to see him there, but Derek paid no attention. He moved through the room quietly, offering his hand to the older women who greeted him, bending down to listen to the children who tugged at his sleeve, and contributing without fanfare to the donation jar at the front. Maya watched him from across the room, her chest tightening with something she had not felt in years: hope. At one point during the evening, the diner owner called for a few words from anyone who wished to speak. To Maya's surprise, Derek stood. The room hushed instantly as he walked to the front. He cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping over faces that reflected both curiosity and skepticism. "I've spent most of my life in boardrooms speaking to people who measure worth by numbers and deals," he began, his voice steady. "But tonight, I want to say something different. Wealth means nothing if it isn't used to lift others. Power means nothing if it isn't used to protect dignity, and strength means nothing if it isn't shared with those who need it most. I forgot that truth once, but someone reminded me." His eyes found Maya in the crowd, and though he didn't speak her name, the message was clear. "So tonight, I stand not as a CEO, not as a man of wealth, but as a man who has learned what truly matters. And I promise you, this is only the beginning." The room erupted in applause, genuine and thunderous. Maya felt tears sting her eyes, not because of the words alone, but because of the sincerity she heard in them. Derek had not spoken as a billionaire to impress his peers. He had spoken as a man transformed by humility, by courage, by the influence of someone who had refused to let him hide behind his wealth. Later that night, as the event ended and the crowd dispersed, Derek walked Maya home once more. The air was cool, the street quiet, the moon casting a soft glow over the cracked sidewalks. For a long time, they walked in silence, both lost in thought. Finally, Derek spoke. "Maya," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant, "you changed me. I don't know if you believe that, but it's true. You saw me when I didn't see myself. And I don't want this to end here. I want more. Not because I need to win, not because I'm used to getting what I want, but because, with you, I feel human again. Maya stopped, her heart pounding. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. For so long, she had built walls around her heart, protecting herself from disappointment, from false promises. But now, standing here, she saw a man who had torn down his own walls, not with grand gestures of wealth, but with actions that spoke louder than any words. Slowly she smiled, though her eyes glistened. Then don't prove it with speeches, Derek. Prove it with a lifetime. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a promise, a beginning, a shared recognition that the wrong car had led them to the right journey. And as they stood beneath the quiet glow of the city lights, the millionaire who had once lived for power and the woman who had once lived only to survive realized they had discovered something far greater together. The strength to change, the courage to love, and the truth that the most valuable treasures are found not in wealth but in the people who challenge us to become more than we ever believed we could be.